Here today, as we get into 1 Samuel, I want you to know that this is something that about a year ago we kind of put into place as we kind of created a year-long teaching plan. And I'm really excited about this. I'm really excited about what this is going to look like in our church because this book and this story is incredibly inspiring to me personally. Our middle child, her middle name is Hannah. And I believe that the story arc in here and what we see here is such an incredible picture of faithfulness that I wanted my daughter to be able to look at Hannah and to be able to see the story arc of her faithfulness and be able to be a woman that prayed prayers like Hannah, to be a woman that operated like Hannah. And for each of my kids, their middle name is the picture that I want them to ultimately live their life out to be. I want them to say, if my dad is not good enough, I want them to look at scripture and be able to say, man, maybe this man or maybe this woman is somebody that can see. And these are the pictures that I think create powerful moments for us to be able to say, this is where I want this to look. And this is what I love about 1 Samuel, that we can go through, and we do this quite regularly in Paul, and we go through books of the Gospels where we see all these commandments and we talk about these commandments. But in this moment, we get to see pictures. We get to see how powerful it looks when this is played out well and when this is played out destructively. And this is what I believe causes us to have ultimate changes when we see pictures of this. This is why, and I love what was said up here earlier about how community changes us, because we don't just hear the scripture, we don't just hear the gospel, we see pictures of the gospel, because when believers live in community, this is the best understanding we have about what it would look like if we saw Jesus face to face. And so we believe that this whole church is oriented around believers that are living life in community, gospel-centered lives, so that we bring people into this and say, this is what it looks like. This is the good news played out right in front of you. We can tell you all this stuff, but let me show you what gospel-centric love looks like. And I hope that that captures your heart, and so that you say, I'm all in with Jesus. And this is where Samuel helps us. In this chapter, I'm so excited that as we planned out this, that I get to talk with you about Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 8. Because 1 Samuel chapter 8, if you look in the scope of the narrative of the Bible, is one of the most significant chapters in terms of what it does. Because what it does is it takes, in this moment in the history of God's people, it sets a trajectory that for the next few hundred years kind of create the narrative of God's people. And here's why it's so important, is as we begin to get into this, as we begin to understand it, really that same narrative is that narrative that is accessible and is a part of our very narratives and our stories. And the things that they're going to have to figure out are the very things we figure out. And so what I want to do is I want to get to this. If you have your copy of Scripture, I want you to follow along with me. And I think there's going to be places for us to underline, places for us to highlight in our devices if we carry devices with the Bible in them. But I think this is something that might be able to help us as we begin just to live out our lives. And let me begin with with verse 1 of chapter 8 here in 1 Samuel. It says this. Okay, let me just back up really quick. What we saw over the last few chapters, there's been a time gap from 4 through 7, from 7 to 8. There's been a time gap. All of a sudden, Samuel is old, and it says at the very beginning, we see God do these incredible things. And that irony sets up what they're about to ask. The irony of what we begin to see God do in just these incredible ways, that God is like doing stuff that is just mind-blowing kind of things. He's taking, he's providing for them. He's protecting them. He's making sure that his people have all that they need. And here we arrive at verse 1 of chapter 8. It says this: when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah. And they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." Okay, so what we begin to see is Samuel is getting old, and there's this secession that is going to take place that he is leading up. What he does is he chooses his kids to do this. The elders gather around and say, your kids aren't like you. You are upstanding. You are the guy who led us into this very incredible part of our history. And this is just an amazing thing that you are leading us in. But your kids, they're not like you. But here's what happens. Among a very sensible thing, okay? You don't want someone who perverts justice, and that might be a sensible thing to ask of Samuel. But here's what they do. Here's the key thing to this. It says this: such as all the other nations have. Now, this phrase is the phrase that really clarifies what's going on in the hearts of the people that are there. These are God's people. In the last few chapters, right, in their history, they have seen God move in an incredible way and set up a narrative, a story in their life where he has been their protector, their provider, and their leader for all of these things. And yet here they come, and they go to Samuel, and the window by which they begin to see something can change. What they do is they ask for something that's like every single other nation around them. They look out and they say, we want what they have. And here's where this is powerful. These leaders use a logical reason to justify a sinful behavior. These people are not asking for a king that God has promised. And as we look back in Deuteronomy, we see that even Moses says, here, you're going to go to the promised land, and then you're going to want a king. I'm going to set you up to know that this is going to go out for you in this kind of way. It says they were asking for a king like all the other nation has. And when Samuel describes what this will happen, they're insistent that they want a king in this. They want him to go and fight their battles for him, because what they want to be is a nation like every other nation. In essence, what they wanted to be is a different identity. They didn't want to be Israel. They wanted something like everyone else had. They are saying that this is not what we want to be. I know that God, you've said that this is what you're going to be. And even this idea of the holiness of God, when we begin to see the holiness of God, that might be purity, or it might be a lot of things. But one of the ways that we could describe it is to be set apart. That God and his people was to be holy people, and this holy kind of people is to be like God. And God is saying, I'm not like anyone else. I'm not like anyone else. And his people are saying, hey, we want to be just like them. But God is saying to them, here, you are to be set apart. And this is where it begins to get this kind of, they were God's special people with a special relationship with God. They were a holy nation set apart for God. They were called to be a light to the other nations. In other words, they had a missional identity. They were to be like God so they could reveal God to all the nations. So God was saying, this is who I am. I want to reveal my glory. I want to show how life is supposed to be, to reveal who I am as creator in this way. They're saying, we don't want to be the people that reveal how different and holy and set apart you are, that people that say this is who God is, we want to be just like everyone else. This is a powerful moment for them. They say, we want a king. See, Samuel was a judge. He was a prophet. He was over them, leading their way. But this is a profound thing in their hearts. They were supposed to be a nation whose behavior was governed by God. And God was ruling over them with his word. But instead, their behavior was being governed by what other people do. They were supposed to be different, distinct, and holy, but instead they wanted to be the same. They wanted to conform. They wanted to fit in. They were supposed to be a light to the nations, revealing the righteousness of God. But instead, the nations were instead of the nations learning from Israel, Israel's learning from the nations. All right, this is the whole thing that messes everything. God says, you're my people. You're to say, this is what this looks like. And instead, his people are saying, we're going to learn from everywhere else. We're going to take their customs. We're going to take their culture. And we're going to say what they have is better. And I want to say for us, this is their temptation, but it's also our temptation. This is what's difficult for us oftentimes. There's always a temptation to shift our gaze from following God to following those around us. The culture is always going to pull us. See, in this, king ideology is so easy to fall into. because oftentimes we don't see the end goal. We don't see the end product. We don't see ultimately what this ends up to be. And we begin to think, hey, you know what? I know that God says that I should have sexual purity in this way, but I really want this, right? And so everywhere around me says that this is okay. And so instead of being set apart, instead of doing things differently in God's way, I'm just going to succumb to everything else, right? So everywhere around me, I see this greed that takes over. Then I could use all this stuff, and I need to leverage all of my gifts and skills that have been given to me by God to get as much as I can for my own personal pleasure. And God says, you know what? You're called to radical generosity. And we look around and say, I'd rather have the stuff than the generosity, right? This is where we get tempted to look around and say, you know what? Normal is out there, not normal is God. That we're not set apart, or we're not okay to be set apart, or we begin to think that God is not good enough in this kind of way. And what God wants to do for us, what God wants to do for them, God did this incredible stuff. He lays out all the stuff. He provides for them in miraculous ways. And yet they say, we want something else. And this is so easy for us to live unremarkable lives, to live just these really just normal lives when God's called us to be holy people, set apart, just a little different, and maybe more than just a little different. And yet sometimes that little different is uncomfortable for us. And so we don't want to be a little different. But when we're not a little different, also it's not awkward for us, but it's also incredibly unremarkable for the world. And so when the world looks at us and says, that's what Jesus is, that's what it means to follow Jesus, well, it doesn't look any different than my lives. And here's what is crazy. As we begin to look at this, we need to understand that God has called us to live lives that don't look like the world. And that's hard sometimes. But what we're going to see is the hard on the front side has an incredible benefit on the back side, and vice versa. In this is why I love seeing believers in East Asia, because when I see them live out their lives, they are always remarkable because they're always countercultural, because they look at that and they say, I'm set apart. I don't want that. That's not appealing to me, because there's something else that has captured my heart. And us in the Western world, if we could actually get that it's not always okay for us to just try not to be weird. That when we begin to live remarkable lives, it begins to paint pictures that people say, hey, that's different. And at first it might seem weird. We might sound like outliers, but I promise you, in the end of this, when people see the repetitive nature, when the rhythm of our lives, at some point there'll be somebody that presses in and says, there's something there that you have. There's an unfading joy that you have in this circumstance that I can't understand why you would have joy in this circumstance. There's this thing that you're seeing that I see you in a significantly different way. And maybe you don't have all the stuff, and maybe you seem like you're bound to a different set of rules. And I don't understand those, but there's something different about you, something remarkable about you. And here's what I want to call us to, for us to be the people who God does the fighting for us, where God does the providing for us, where God does the protecting for us, where God leads us out and calls us to different standards. And we begin to say, I'll trust you, God, that I don't have I want a king mentality. I already have a king mentality. So I look at the world and I just say, no, thank you. And that's radically different. And parents, let me press into us. I think that many times we hear and we bring our kids and we hear the things of the gospel, and then we go live our lives in ways that look much like the world. In fact, not too long ago, someone said about our family, I know you're a family with high values. And it kind of broke my heart, because I want to be somebody who's more than just someone with high values. That this is not just a moral thing that I come and I try to align my life and be inspired every week, but there's something else that is the definitive nature. And my desire is that once you get close to the Weezers, you begin to smell the gospel, not just high moral values and inspired living. I think that oftentimes, if we don't take living remarkable lives seriously as parents, what we do is a lot of what I grew up with. We hear a lot about the gospel, but the gospel doesn't ultimately lead to a remarkable life. And it creates children that oftentimes have a spiritual crisis because there's a distance between what they hear and what they see. And I want us to be people who do the sometimes radical things. And there's incredibly remarkable things. And I want to challenge you to one day, instead of going to church here in the Palouse, maybe you go up to Cheney and you begin to say, well, there's another group of people who moved from the Palouse because it was uncomfortable just to stay here. It wasn't comfortable just to stay here because people on campus needed to hear the gospel. Or we say, we're going to take a road trip and we're going to go to the launch of the church there at Eugene, Resonate Eugene, right? Because that is something that really reveals what this looks like for us to be able to say, this is remarkable. For us to say, maybe we give away the money that we were going to do a vacation with and we go serve that week, right? And I'm not saying this to make us guilty. I'm just saying that oftentimes we can talk about things, we can hear about things, and yet ultimately there's something that ultimately says, I look at the world and actually just want what the world looks like. I just want the inspiration from the gospel. I'm going to have all my plans as plan A and use God as plan B. And God always says, I want to be plan B. I want to be plan A in your life. What does it look like? Where are you and I tempted to say, we want a king. We want the American dream with God sprinkles. We want that, but not something radically different. Again, I'm challenged to the core as I come back from people that set hours in a basement room, craving to know more about the gospel so that they could go back to their villages and they could go back to their cities and gather around their 30 to 100 people in these house church networks and to be able to tell them about Jesus and to know that every time that costs them alienation from their parents, social ridicule, but they say it's better. And guys, that's what it looks like to say, God is my protector, my provider, my leader, and not the American dream. And not really, I just want this with inspiration. And here's what they see. Here's what this looks like for us to make more than just a hobby. For moments that we say, hey, we don't want a king. Here's what they say. It says this in verse 6. But when they say, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord, and the Lord told him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. That is a powerful, powerful phrase. As they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt till this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. So even God's saying to Samuel, he said, here's what happens. That I've brought them out of, I've done things that a king could never do. And yet they still go back to looking around and say, we want to be like the Amorites. We want to be like the Philistines. We want to be like the Moabites. All the people around us, we want to be like them. We want to have their customs in this way. And just real quick, I want to make a point about this, that what God does in Samuel's heart is just a profound thing. If you're a leader, if you're someone who has a role of helping other people to experience God or helping other people to follow after God, oftentimes when you are leading people, what they're going to do is they're going to look around and they're going to choose something else. And you're pouring your life into people and they're going to say, no, thank you. I'd rather have this than God. I'd rather take the easy win instead of the best thing. This looks good, so I'll take this even though it's not best. And this is something that can seem incredibly rejecting to you as a leader. Here's what God says to him. He says, it is not you they have rejected, but it is me as king. What this means is for us to be able to understand. Oftentimes, when you're a leader, here are the two things: to either pull back and say, I won't tell them the hard stuff. I won't tell them the truth. I won't tell them what they need to hear because I feel rejected by this. Or we press in and we make it personal and we say, hey, whatever it is you're going to say to them, right? But you say, why did you reject this, right? Because it feels like you're rejecting me. But God says neither one of those are the right thing for you to understand that you continue to speak the truth in love. That you continue to balance grace and truth, but you continue to do this and you don't take it personal. And so if you are leading, you will be rejected. Many times at being a pastor at Resonate Church, there's people I've poured into that have walked the other way, and it breaks my heart, but it can't ever break my spirit, because I know ultimately if I'm faithful to give them the truth of God's word, then that is what they're rejecting and not me. And I don't have to go home and cry that I'm rejected. I weep for them and their hearts, but not for me. I don't make it about me. And here's what God is saying: don't make it about you, Samuel. This is about something bigger than you and your position. See, all of us, there's nothing special about me. I'm just a servant of God towards this. If this church ever becomes about Keith, it has become about the wrong thing, because here's the thing: they have rejected me as king. This is what this is about. We see in chapters 4-7 that the Lord is independently capable of doing the things that defeat Israel's enemies. He leads the people to victory in this. He gives his people victory. This is what God is doing. Now they're trading in him for a human king, just like everyone else has done. See, a king could have never done what God did in this kind of way. And here's what they're saying: we reject God. So not only do they look around, and not only is it tempting for us to say, other people have it better than us. Look at all the things that has become normal. But they're saying, we don't believe that God's way is the best way. And this is at the root. When we begin to have our eyes saying, I'd rather have that house, I'd rather have that car, I'd rather have that wardrobe, I'd rather have this thing, I'd rather have that thing, I'd rather have that security, I'd rather have whatever it is, right? All the things that are around us, all the things that are easy for us to have, I'd rather have that, right? I'd rather do what it takes to have that boyfriend. Whatever it is, right? When we begin to say that, what we're saying is, God, I don't believe that you are ultimately the thing that is going to protect, provide, and lead me to what is best. We have an issue, and we begin to have this idea: if I don't, it won't. If I don't, it won't. I'm going to reject you, God, because I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to create up my own scenario by which I can control my life, because I think I'm going to do it better than you're going to do it. And so I'm going to look around at the best wisdom that humans have to offer and figure out how to get what I want out of life. And we reject God in a significant way. We don't trust God. And rejecting God's ways are always rejecting God as king. I want you to get that, because I want you to understand that you can't live a life of rejecting God's ways and just think, I'm good with God. No, you're not. You hate God. Because rejecting God's ways is rejecting God. You can't live a duplicitous life of saying, I'm gonna look around and get my wisdom from the world around me and then cry out to God in worship songs. It doesn't work that way. When you reject God's ways, you reject God as king. You reject God in that relationship. And so here's what this looks like for us. And just like them, here's what happens. They see God bring them out of Egypt, provide for them, open up the promised land, defeat their enemies, over and over. All of this stuff, God is doing this in incredible and remarkable ways, right? We see all of these amazing things, and they say, God, what have you done for me lately? Because if it's not God, what have you done for me lately? I'm going to reject you wholeheartedly in this kind of way. And so here's what happens. And here's the reality that we face, just like the Israelites faced, that we are forgetful people. We are forgetful people. That we see God do something, and we're amazed in a moment. We see God's work in a friend. We see and hear God's work in a part of our church. And we isolate that from our life, one, and we forget that so easily for number two. And let me just give you just 4 ideas for how to overcome faithful or forgetfulness. One, I need you to get this truth. This is not really a thing, but this is really an idea. God is always at work around you. If you believe that God is always at work around you, here's the thing that it's going to be incredibly helpful for you to understand, is that when you begin to understand that God is at work around you, you're going to be able to have lenses to see this. So number one, believe that God is always at work around you, if they would just to see that God is always doing stuff around them, it would have been so easy for them just to say, you know what, I'd rather choose God than the king that I do not know. I've seen proof of God for the last 1,000 years. A king we don't know. Number 2, pray to see God at work around you. Pray that you would not only believe this, but that you would begin to see this. That you would begin to see. And I ask our team in East Asia, I said, here's what I want you to get. I want you to have this as a mind-blowing, earth-shattering experience for you. And I need you to be able to get that God is going to be doing something around you every single day. And if you don't see it, you're not going to understand the story that you're a part of. But if you begin to pray, God, open my eyes and let me see what you're doing around me, I promise you, just try it. My 10 weeks that I spent in the summer, my sophomore year, after my sophomore year in college, was when I really began to pray into this prayer, God, let me see what you're doing around me. And all of a sudden, my life was never the same because I began to see all these things. I began to realize that God was subtly at work in all these ways around me. Number 3, ask this question. Where did I see? Not only is God giving you eyes to see this, but ask the question, God, what are you doing? I want you to get this specific. And then number 4, I want you to record God's activities. One of the best things to keep you from forgetting that God is king is for you to journal about all that God has done and refer back to that. And go and look at what God has done. And so in the moments where you would say, I can't, it's really easy for me to look beyond and say, hey, I want a king. I want another king. When you look back at your journal and see how faithful your heavenly Father has been, your heavenly King has been to you, it'll be easier to say, you know what? I don't want to do that. I don't want to act like I want an earthly king when my heavenly King has given me all that I need. The temptation, if I don't, it won't. We go on. What happens? So he's saying, I want you to help clarify what the alternative is. It says this in verse 10. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, this is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some of them he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters, and they will be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and the olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He'll take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you'll cry out for relief from this king that you've chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Here's what he's saying. This is so profound. God is saying to Solomon, here's what you have to tell them. You have to tell them that there's a consequence for looking beyond their heavenly king. If I'm not their king and they choose a human king, here's what's going to happen. They think in their minds right now that the earthly king is going to be the thing that's going to allow them to be able to conquer the Amalekites, the Moabites, the Philistines, the Ammonites, right? That they're going to be safe and they're going to have all of this plunder and they're going to be rulers of this if they just have someone to unite all the tribes and to be able to focus them in a way that exudes the power of the Israelites, right? That's what they think. But God says, here's the thing. You think that this is going to be the thing, but you don't understand because you can't see in your finite amount of wisdom what's on the other side of that decision. Let me tell you what it is. It's all of these things that he is going to demand of you. And rightfully so as your king. This king and this kingdom has to be financed. And you and your sacrifice will finance this. Not me and God, who's abundant in all of its things, and I can do this without demanding this from you. Ultimately, this will demand from you a significant sacrifice. So you will have to sacrifice for something that you want in a way that is much greater than you believe it will be. See, you don't understand the cost. You don't understand what will require of you. The kings that are earthly kings will take more than they give. But right now, you only have eyes to see what you could get from an earthly king. And in this is the same thing for you and I. The same thing that puts us into a place where oftentimes we get off the tracks is when we look at something, we say, that's what I want. If I just get enough money for that, that'll supply all my needs. That'll make me happy, right? And then it doesn't make you happy and you need something else. But that means that you have to work harder for this, or you have to leverage this, or have a second mortgage for that, right? And so it builds up and builds up and builds up. And you don't realize that it's costing you to be able to get to this thing that's ultimately not getting you where you want. That you want to have this kind of boyfriend or have this kind of girlfriend. And yet, so if you just do this thing, it's not God's way, but it'll get you what you want and it'll get you there, okay? If you just do this one thing or make this one deal, it's a little shady, but it's going to get you there. But that's going to come back and get you. And you don't understand the cost of doing things in ways that are not God's ways. And every single time we say, I don't want him as king, I want them as king, it costs us more than we realize. Every single time. And this is what is so hard when we talk about sexual purity. To be able to say, you understand that this porn problem is ultimately going to be a sex problem. You understand that this is not going to get you the intimacy that you want with your spouse. You understand that when you treat your body this way, that this is going to have long-term cost, right? You understand that when you don't do things God's way with your resources, it doesn't bring you the happiness that you desire, right? You understand that those little lies cause shame. That shame causes self-hatred. That self-hatred is not ever going to get you where you want. These are the things when we look apart and we say, I want a king. I want that. We don't understand. Here's the thing. Walking by faith instead of by sight means that we trust that the cost of disobedience is always higher than the cost of obedience. When we walk by faith and not by sight, we understand that the cost of disobedience is always higher than the cost of obedience. C.S. Lewis writes an article, and it's called The Cost of Non-Discipleship. And it's in response to Dietrich Bonhoeffer that wrote this thing called the Cost of Discipleship. Powerful thing, right? That we begin to see what this looks like as we begin to understand, hey, what is the cost of discipleship, right? What does it cost for us to say yes to Jesus, to be set apart? But there's this other part that we don't realize, the cost of non-discipleship, the cost of not following God, the cost of not doing things God's way. This is bigger than we ever realize. And this is wisdom. And when we begin to understand it, here's what I want for many of us who are young. I want you to be able to walk through life without significant moments of despair. Without you walking through these moments where you look back and say, I wish I would have done it different. And for you to say, I'm going to trust God's ways are better. I know this doesn't make a whole lot of sense because I've been trained in a worldview that puts culture as king and not God as king. But I'm going to walk in a holy, set apart kind of way. I'm going to treat my money as God says to treat my money. I'm going to treat my relationships. I'm going to seek reconciliation even though it's awkward. And I'd rather just be passive about it. I'm going to go in and say, I want to make this right, because I know the long-term relationship is going to be better. There's two stories that I get to hear as about 8 years into this journey at Resonate Church. One, I let God, and look what happened. I let God do this. I let God take me. I said open-handedly, blank check in my life, and look what happened. It is amazing. I never would have thought I'd be here. And the other not so cool thing that unfortunately social media lets me see more of than I want is I decided to do it my way. And look what happened. I want us to see these things and understand, hey, this is what happens. That this is what God is saying. You don't realize that this is what's going to happen. At some point you'll say, God, can you save us from the king that we ask for? God, I so want this boyfriend. Would you give me a boyfriend? I want this guy. I want this guy. I want this guy. God, would you deliver me from this relationship? I so wanted this. God, will you give me this? Will you give me this? God, somehow this didn't satisfy. And here's what we do. What happens? Verse 19, but the people refused to listen to Samuel. No, they said, we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles. Then Samuel heard what the people said and repeated it before the Lord. The Lord answered, listen to them and give them a king. Okay, this is the most haunting part of this entire story. Because God doesn't say, no, I will not give them a king, because that is not what's best for them. Okay, lean in with me, right? Okay. I want you to know that God is after your heart, not after you as a robot. And when that happens, when you desire for something that is an earthly king and not a heavenly king, he doesn't stop you. So we walk into traps. And we walk into moments where it's not ultimately going to feed our hearts. And this is what I wish God was different in. I wish God would just say, no, under no circumstances am I going to give you something that's bad for you. But he wants our worship. He wants our hearts, not just a robotic behavior from us. And so he says, okay, if that's what you want, I'm going to give it to you. And here's what happens. We see this over and over. Then he says to the Israelites, everyone go back to your town. It's done. They get a king. It doesn't turn out well. We'll get to that in the next couple of chapters, where it goes downhill, where all this remarkable things that have happened, they become a very unremarkable group of people until David comes in. I want to go and fast forward to chapter 12. So we're in chapter 8. I want to go to chapter 12. Here's what happens. The people realize that they have made a colossal mistake. And let's see what chapter 12, verse 19, they say this. The people all said to Samuel, pray to the Lord your God for your servants that we will not die, for we have added to all our other sins the evil of asking for a king. They begin to realize this is going down. Do not be afraid. This is what we need to understand. And this is the incredible redemptive moment, right? Samuel says, you may have done all of this evil, yet do not turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all of your heart. Do not turn away after useless idols. This is so powerful for us because there's so many things that are trying to capture our hearts. Do not turn away from the useless idols. Anything that says that will rescue me or that'll satisfy me is an idol if it is not ultimately in Christ alone. Get this. They can do you no good, nor can they rescue you because they are useless. And now here's where we see this. For the sake of his great name. This is powerful because this is not that place not for your sake, not for my sake, for his sake. This is God saying, I'm going to get the glory from this. That ultimately this points back to me, and what I want to draw you is not for your sake, but for my sake, so that you begin to live your life and you're saying, it is for the glory of God. It is because God is to be worshiped, not I get stuff from God, right? So God is not our cosmic Santa Claus that we just say, if I pray hard enough, I'll get all this stuff. I'll be protected, provided for. I'll be led really well. But to be able to glorify God and say, just because you are God, not because of what I get out of you, am I going to worship? For the sake of his great name, the Lord will not reject his people, because the Lord was pleased to make you his own. So now we've come full circle. I've delivered you from the Egyptians. I've fought for you in the promised land. You want a king? You've rejected me, but you are still my own. And they will continue to do this over and over. And here's where the beautiful part comes in. 1,000 years later, God sends his only son, Jesus, to this earth, and he lives on this earth for a singular purpose, to be able to reunite all of us as God's people. And so he stands in front of the Roman governor, and that Roman governor says to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Right? Who's the king? Who's the king? And what does Jesus say? "My kingdom is not of this world." What is he saying? I'm not a king like every other king. I've come so that you may be reconciled to God and to be his people. And so here's the thing. All these things that Samuel said to them, that God is going to be your people, because God said, I'm not going to just make the Israelites my people. I'm going to make everyone who calls upon my name and trust in my son, Jesus Christ, my people, and say, well, they will have access to me as their heavenly king. And so we will not have to look to earthly kings anymore, because I will be their king. This is the profound thing. Jesus says, I'm not going to be a king like every other king. My kingdom is not of this world. And yet my kingdom affects every other part of every kingdom in this world. Walking by faith, not by sight. So for us, we have the offer of God's people, the offer to us to say, here's what I want to do for you. I don't want you to look at other kingdoms. I don't want you to look at other things and be tempted by that. I want to lead. I want to protect. I want to provide for you so that you may be able to trust me in everything, because I've sent my son to capture your heart and make you my people so that I could be your king. And I want to win your hearts so that you may worship me in spirit and in truth and walk by faith and not by sight.